Hello, I'm Stephen Fagan, curator of the sixth floor museum at Dealey Plaza. Our institution's ongoing oral history project explores the history and culture of the 1960s, as well as the life, death, and legacy of President John F. Kennedy. This year, to celebrate Martin Luther King Day and Black History Month, we are pleased to present Voices from the Civil Rights Movement, a special series of recent oral history interviews with 1960s activists. In these intimate, detailed one-on-one conversations, an outstanding group of storytellers share powerful memories from several key moments of the movement, including the Montgomery bus boycott, freedom rides, the March on Washington, Mississippi Freedom Summer, the Selma to Montgomery March, and the Scope project of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We hope that these remarkable, relevant stories will spark conversation and build bridges of understanding and communication between generations. Please keep in mind that these are full, free-flowing oral history interviews. In addition to moments of technical difficulties, there may be harsh language and graphic descriptions of violence. Viewer discretion is advised. If you or someone you know would like to share memories of the 1960s or articulate how President Kennedy has impacted your life, please contact us at oralhistory@jfk.org. We continue to record conversations year-round as part of this ongoing archival initiative, and we believe that everyone has a story. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy these voices from the civil rights movement. And sir, at the start, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves, if they would, with a full name, date and place of birth, and just a little background about yourself.
Yes, I'm Raphael Cassimere Jr. I was born March 2nd, 1942. I'm a sixth-generation New Orleanian. I grew up and remained in New Orleans except for the time I spent in graduate school, and when unfortunately I was displaced from my home after Hurricane Katrina in 2005.
Let's go way back if we could. Maybe you could talk a little bit, because these oral histories are intended for a younger audience, not alive in the 1960s. Share some childhood recollections of your first encounters with prejudice and with segregation in New Orleans.
Oh, I grew up in a racially mixed neighborhood. I went to an all-Black school, which was actually farther from my house than the all-white school. But of course, that was the way things were in the 1940s and 1950s when I went. The thing that I most remember about race relations was the Brown decision, May 17, 1954. And of course, the anniversary is coming up on this coming Monday. It's interesting, it's on the Monday again. I was a 12-year-old, seventh grade student, and I was in the classroom of the ranking teacher who happened to have a telephone. Because she was a ranking teacher, she had a telephone. Nobody else had a phone other than the people who worked in the office. Miss Anna Case, who was kind of a legend because she had taught not only all of our older siblings, but had taught some of our parents. She looked white, could easily have passed for white. And everybody in the neighborhood knew Mr. Case. If you were shooting crap, you stopped when Mr. Case came. If you were doing something that was off a little bit, you stopped because Mr. Case. She was a devout Catholic, always praying for us poor sinners. When she got off the telephone, she did something that she didn't do very often. She smiled, and she tried to tell us the essence of the Brown decision. Not long after that, the principal came through, and he was talking to teachers who apparently knew something about the impact of that decision. Now, even though my parents were socially conscious, they didn't know anything about the Brown decision. But I remember thinking, I wonder if my white neighbors would be going to school with me. I lived about a half block from the school. They had to go maybe a little more than a half mile to get to the white school. And because none of that happened. I wasn't conscious of the fact at that particular time, but gradually whites in my neighborhood began moving out into a neighboring parish, St. Bernard Parish, which was overwhelmingly white at that particular time. I didn't know that it probably had some impact upon the possibility of school desegregation. But after I graduated from my all-white, all-Black elementary school in 8th grade, I had to attend junior high on the bus. And even though I had ridden a bus in the past, the screens which separated Black and white passengers affected me more. There was a little wooden screen about 18 inches in length, maybe 4 or 5 inches in width. And it did not physically keep black and white passengers from touching. But the screen, which moved up and down, prevented blacks and whites from sitting together. The wording on the screen was for colored patrons only. And of course, if you were black, you sat behind the screen. If you were white, you sat in front of it. For whatever reason, that bothered me. It apparently bothered other people, but maybe not as much as it bothered me. And I remember when I was in ninth grade, I used to turn the screen around so I didn't have to read it. Now, even though whites sat in front of it, I remember one day I was coming home and I turned the screen around. There were not many people on the bus. There was an older white man on the bus, and he resented my action. And he demanded, as whites were used to doing at that particular time, that I turn the screen around, and I wouldn't. By chance, 2 white policemen got on the bus, and he threatened to have me arrested. He didn't say anything to them. They were looking for somebody, a black guy in the back of the bus. They passed me, got him off the bus. He didn't say anything to the policeman, thank God, but he cursed me out, and he turned the screen around. And of course, to me, that was my first little civil rights victory. I was about 13 years old. And I remember when the screens were removed 3 years later, and I had a chance to sit right behind the driver. And I think the response to my action was puzzling, because the blacks on the bus felt that I should not have been so forward. We had the right, but we shouldn't use the right. But anyway, I began sitting right behind the bus driver, and I think I must have been a junior in high school at that particular time. And that was my first involvement in any kind of protest, and it was a solitary protest. I didn't tell anybody about it, but in my mind, I had won something.
Wow. You were close in age to Emmett Till. Give me a sense how his murder, I mean, for a child close to your own age, how did that affect you?
Emmett Till was a year older than I was. I remember very, very well the case, because I remember seeing that horrible picture of him in the casket in Jet magazine. But when it happened, I remember my homeroom teacher telling the boys to leave white women alone, because the inference was he must have done something wrong. That had an impact upon me. I didn't do very much about it, but I do remember following the story. And later, I think maybe about 25 or 30 years later, I met his mother. I met his mother at NAACP convention in Chicago in 1994. So that was almost 40 years later. And I remember she mentioned that she made the decision, she wanted his casket open. She wanted the world to see what they had done to her son. And she explained how apprehensive she had been about him going south. She had moved from Mississippi to Chicago, and her relatives in Mississippi had told her things would change. They were not as bad as they were, because we found that they were pretty bad. So that was one of the things in my childhood youth that I remember negatively about what could happen to people who were involved or were suspected of being involved in the civil rights movement.
I know you became actively involved with NAACP Youth Council around 1960, right?
Yes.
Of course, that was the election year, Kennedy versus Nixon. Prior to joining the NAACP Youth Council, did you have any real political awareness? Were you interested in politics?
Oh, absolutely. My parents did not register until 1946, because blacks were largely prevented from registering to vote by being denied an opportunity to join the Democratic Party. And if you did not vote in the Democratic Party, effectively, you didn't have a vote, even if you were registered. There might have been 2,000 or 3,000 black Republicans, but at that particular time, between 1900 and 1960, every single public official in the state was a Democrat. If you won the Democratic nomination, you won. In many cases, the Republicans did not even challenge. If they did, they were not going to win. But my parents registered in 1946, and they voted for the quote-unquote reform-minded mayor, Chuck Morrison, and they were actively involved. I remember how exciting it would be on the election night, because we'd listen and we would be writing down the returns for governor, for mayor, whatever the election was. So they were very actively involved politically. But when I attended the branch of LSU in New Orleans, I went there the second year the school opened. It was not intended to be integrated, but it was by court order in 1958. That was my senior year in high school. I entered in 1959, the second year the school was open. And of course, there were incidents involved in segregation. Blacks could in fact attend classes, but the cafeteria was closed to blacks. There was in fact a stand-up only snack bar where we could eat. We could not attend any non-academic function. And I remember when the sit-ins began in the spring of 1960, we organized a boycott against the snack bar because we were not allowed to go into the cafeteria. I was one of the leaders of that. And in the summer of 1960, one of my friends invited me to an organization meeting of the NAACP Youth Council. There had been a youth council before, but it had become dormant. He invited me, and I didn't intend to go because, again, I had the background of Emmett Till, and there was some other incidents I had known about people involved in civil rights. And I promised him I would come fully, not intending to come. But by chance, we were at the public library, and he brought me to the meeting. And I saw so many people from LSUNO. Even though I had not actually joined, I was elected vice president. I joined before I actually had paid my membership, which I paid the next week. So I became vice president, and I was put in charge of a voter registration campaign, trying to get blacks to register to vote in advance of the Kennedy-Nixon election in 1960. Most of us, of course, were Kennedy supporters. I found out how very difficult it was to get people to register, because if you failed to calculate accurately your age on the registration form, you had to indicate, I am now 21 years, 10 months, and 13 days. And if you were one day off, you failed. And you could not go back for 30 days. And we found that there were a lot of older blacks who really wanted to register to vote. And then when they put in the so-called civics test, a test supposedly designed to assure that you had at least a good 6th grade education. And it creates a question, who's the second president of the United States? Again, I knew John Adams because I knew all of the presidents. Most blacks knew 2 presidents. Everybody knew George Washington was the first president. All blacks knew Abraham Lincoln had been president. So invariably, there were a lot of blacks who assumed that, well, Lincoln must be the second president because he was the 16th. Crazy question. How many senators does each state have? Everybody should know that, but a lot of people didn't know that. What is the size in square miles of the District of Columbia? Questions like that. And I remember I was in a political action class, and we had a similar test, I think it was either Alabama or South Carolina, that the average Harvard law student got maybe 40 of the 60 questions right. And everybody was shocked because I got 3 wrong, and I didn't even agree with the president, the instructor. I had gotten 3 out of 57. I thought I knew all of them. But anyway, it was very, very tough. We got involved in the first sit-in in September of 1960. It was a joint effort between CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, and the NAACP Youth Council. CORE provided the sit-in demonstrators, and we picketed. And then we got involved in picketing shows like F.W. Woolworth, which was nationwide at that particular time. I don't even know if they have any Woolworths now, but F.W. Woolworth, Grants, McCrory's, Crest. And we picketed. It didn't make any significant difference. But then we began a 2-year boycott in 1963. And I remember that because that's when Kennedy proposed a comprehensive Civil Rights Act, which he did not live to see come into fruition, but it came to pass under his successor, Lyndon Johnson. So we were very actively involved. We were supposed to go to the March on Washington. I didn't get to go because I was involved as president by that time. And the boycott lasted for more than 2 years, almost every day, Monday through Saturday. We were out picketing. We had some success. Eventually, some of the smaller stores began to settle with us, began to hire African-American sales clerks, desegregate their cafeterias, desegregate their restaurant facilities. But it took us over 2 years to end a boycott against nearly 40 stores. That was crazy. Now, when I think back about that, that's not something I would recommend now. And we found out the merchants were as stubborn as we were, but eventually we broke them.
Going back to 1960 for just a moment, you mentioned you were a Kennedy supporter, as most African Americans were. What was the hope? Was there a belief that Kennedy was going to embrace civil rights from the beginning?
No. In fact, there were some blacks who supported Nixon because Nixon was a Republican and the Republican Party really had been more supportive of civil rights than the Democratic Party, which was at that time controlled by Southern Dixiecrats. But Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, had assisted in having him released from prison, where they thought that he had been sentenced and he would probably be assassinated. And as a result of that, King and his father was a registered Republican, indicated that they would not tell anybody else who to vote for, but they were going to vote for Kennedy. And that did, in fact, swing the vote largely because Eisenhower actually had won. I know my father was a Democrat, but he had voted for Eisenhower in 1960. And he had gotten, I think, between 35 and 40% of the Black vote in 1956. So Kennedy got about 80% of the Black vote. And of course, in states like Illinois and New York, that had been very crucial. So we began to believe that what he said, that he believed that Blacks had a legal and a moral right to select the same lunch counter rights and so forth. But he was very, very slow because I know by 1962, we were pretty critical for him not having moved very quickly. And it really was only after the assassination of Medgar Evers in June of 1963, and the increase in activities that he finally proposed a comprehensive Civil Rights Act in the summer of 1963, which did not move very quickly while he was still alive.
You were disappointed in him up until that time?
We were disappointed. In fact, I remember writing him a letter. In fact, I got a letter from President Kennedy. I lost it. Wish I had saved it. And I didn't realize just how difficult it was for him because he didn't have the political capital that Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, had. But he indicated that they were making significant progress in getting voluntary desegregation by companies that did business with the federal government. But actually, he was more reactive. He was responding to the increased activities in the southern states. And by coincidence, the increased activities, of course, were being highlighted by two things that a lot of people don't put together. The launching of the Telstar communication satellite that began to report news instantaneously. Before, they would have to film and then develop the information fly, but now you could see it as it was happening. And the expansion of the national news from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. So there was more reporting as civil rights activities were happening. And that, of course, involved more white students, and many of the white parents began to become concerned because their children were involved. And by the summer of 1963, he felt that he had to do something. He proposed, and of course, we all favored it, but it had not moved by the time of his death.
Let's stay with Kennedy for a moment and tell me about November 22nd, what you remember from that day.
I remember it very well because I remember I was in the student center at LSU New Orleans, and the television came on, CBS News Bulletin. And I don't know how, for some reason, I thought it must be something to do with the president. And I remember Walter Cronkite coming on stating that the president had been shot. And I'm thinking, I wonder if he was dead. And of course, I remember watching, and then he came back on and mentioned that two priests had been in the hospital, indicated that he had died. And I started crying. Something, I was 21 years old, and I'm crying openly. I remember our advisor to the NAACP Youth Council called and said, we're not going to picket until after the funeral. So we didn't picket that weekend. But it had an impact upon us, but also a sort of duplicity. All of the people who had been opposed, because we were in the midst of a candidate, a race for governor. We elect our governors in the fall of odd number of years, and they are inaugurated in the even number of years. So we were in the midst of a campaign for governor of Louisiana in 1963. Chuck Morrison, who had been an ambassador in the Kennedy administration, was the quote unquote liberal candidate. He really wasn't liberal, he was at best a moderate. And most of the other candidates were campaigning against the liberal Kennedy candidate. Well, the election was held, I think, 2 weeks after Kennedy's death, and suddenly there's an outpouring of sympathy. So Morrison received tremendous support. He got about 45% of the vote. He didn't get enough to prevent a runoff. But then all of the people who had been running against Kennedy now had no issue. So Morrison faced John McKeithen. he had almost twice. I think Morrison had like 44% of the vote. McKiffin had maybe 22%. McKiffin came out then as the lone candidate for the people. And he won. He shocked a lot of us. He won. He didn't campaign against Kennedy. He campaigned as an outsider. He won. But very quickly, when he became governor, the Civil Rights Act would pass, I think, within a couple of months of his taking office. And he hired a Black receptionist and basically said, we're going to obey the law. So he changed very quickly from the radical racist candidate he had first run in the first primary in 1963 to a moderate who's going to cooperate. So the Civil Rights Act passed. And I remember when the act passed, I was picketing on Canal Street. And one of my high school teachers, who really didn't like me, she came up to me and said, you did this. You did this. You were responsible for this. And I felt pretty good about that.
Did you notice immediate change after the passage of the Civil Rights Act?
Yes. We put out, the Civil Rights Act passed about 8 o'clock local time. We stopped picketing and went into one of the restaurants that formerly had been all white. And we were served without incident. In fact, we began doing that all over. There were some places that resisted, but for the most part, there was compliance.
Wow. Okay. I hear stories throughout the South of entire communities resisting that for years, even. So that's.
Oh, yeah, but there were pockets of resistance. But I remember the NAACP National Board had a meeting in Jackson, Mississippi in the fall of 1964, just a few months after the law had been passed. And the hotel was integrated. They didn't have any incidents. Now, there were pockets of resistance, I'd say, well into the 60s and maybe even the early 70s. But for the most part, there was compliance. The Civil Rights Act, remember, also included provisions for desegregating hospitals and clinics and so forth. And I remember I was born in Charity Hospital, one of the largest charity hospital systems in the country. That was one of the places that I felt there would be more resistance. And I remember I went with one of the officials of the adult branch of the NAACP to speak with the director of Charity Hospital to remind them that they were covered. And we were shocked with the compliance. In fact, I remember the guy saying, well, if we don't comply, we'll lose about $35 million, and we cannot afford to lose that. And it's interesting, before the Civil Rights Act passed, they rigidly segregated the hospitals. They would C for colored section and the W for white section. And that included the wheelchairs and the beds, the linen, all were labeled C and W. Okay, so they can't throw that away. So they reoriented everything. So now they changed the numbering to C for center, W became west, and then they created an E. And they desegregated the hospital. There were some white patients who resisted, but those were individuals. But that was a change that took place almost seamlessly. I didn't expect. The equal employment opportunities section that Kennedy had proposed, that did in fact become a part of the law, would not go into effect immediately. It would go into effect in stages. In 1965, the largest employers, those who had 100 or more employees, would be covered. And then in 66, those who had 75 or more. And then 67, those who had 50 or more. And then 68, those who had 25 or more employees would be covered. That was very helpful in us getting an end to the boycott, because the largest department stores had not settled with us, but they all had 100 or more employees. And I remember the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission did not become active until 1965. We sent people to apply for jobs at the largest stores. And of course, when they were not hired, we filed complaints. And in fact, of the first 19 complaints filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, 7 of them came from New Orleans. 7 of the first 19 complaints ever filed. And as a result of that, they sent down investigators, and the stores complied, and we settled with them August 12th, 1965. And I remember we had the press conference, and one of the local reporters mentioned that they had been called out numerous times at the beginning of these boycotts. But this was the first time anybody had called them to say that one had ended successfully.
And this was a 2-year effort?
2 years. I mentioned, I never expected to be out there that long. And keep in mind, most of us were students. I was in college. We had high school students. We had grade school students involved. Literally hundreds of people had been involved. Only 5 of us stood the course, but there were people who came and who went. But it was very successful. And in fact, I passed through department stores and I said, we are doing all of that to have people hired as sales clerk. And it goes, in many cases, a majority of the sales clerks are Black now. And I said, they probably don't remember. But I remember maybe about 20 years ago, a young man, he must have been in his 40s. And he came up to me and said, I remember you. I said, you do? He said, I remember you used to picket on Canal and Rampart. He said, I was 7 years old. And my mother used to teach me how to catch a bus by myself. And I remember seeing you picketing. And that was what, 40 years later, I say, wow. So, it had an impact.
Yeah, I hope you had an impact on that young man's life seeing.
Well, he remembered me. And he was 7 at that time. I think he told me like 44, 45. So I must have been in my early 60s.
Hmm. Let me go back just for a moment to the assassination. When you first learned that Kennedy had been killed in Dallas, another segregated city in the South, did you initially connect that with his support from June of '63? Did you think it was a segregationist that had shot the president?
My first thought was, I hope it wasn't a Black. I hope it wasn't a Black assassin. That was my first thought. I thought then later that it must have had people who were opposed to his support for civil rights. I later went to Dallas that year. In fact, my brother married a woman who's from Waco, Texas, which is not far from Dallas. And we went there for Christmas. And I knew NAACP officials in Dallas. And I went to Dallas, and the youth council president from Dallas took me to the Texas Deposit Bookstore, and I saw it for myself. So, that was only really about a month later, because it was like the 28th, I think, of December of 1963 when I saw it for myself. So obviously I had some concern about it, but Kennedy became a hero. The NAACP convention in 1964, the year following, was in DC. And of course, part of the highlight was to go visit his gravesite. And also the Kennedy $50 were released around the same time. So it's something that has stuck with me for a long time. He became a hero, but it was really Lyndon Johnson, because of his political skills, who guided the bill through passage. And it was not passed until we left Washington. We left Washington, I think, around the 22nd of June. No, I think we left Washington around the 1st of July. And the bill was enacted on July 2nd.
Well, you were in Dallas in December. Did you visit with Juanita Craft?
Yes. Well, you know Juanita Craft? Well,
oh, sure.
That was a person, Juanita Craft.
You went to her house?
Juanita Craft was the advisor of the Dallas Youth Council. Mm-hmm. And I went to see her, and she called several of youth, and she was the one who had them to take me down to the site. I knew her very well. Yeah,
she's a local legend. Her home has become a museum about her activism and NAACP Youth Council. And I've had the great pleasure of interviewing a lot of the Craft kids, as they're called, all the young people she influenced over the years. So.
Well, she was in our region. We were in Region 6, the Southwest region of the NAACP. So I knew her well. I attended my second convention. She was the secretary of the Credentials Committee always for many years. But I knew her. She later got involved. She was on the city council in Dallas for a while. Yes, I knew her very well. And it's interesting because I was involved in an exhibit for the World War II Museum, which is here in New Orleans. And I was part of the team that put together the exhibit, Fighting for the Right to Fight, the role of Blacks in the war. There was a picture of Juanita Craft and I forgot the other woman who was the president of the NAACP in Houston, and they were picketing in 1941. That was the year before I was born. And nobody knew. I said, I know these people. There were 3 people who were very actively involved in NAACP, and they were involved for so long. And these were really the pillars of the NAACP.
Yeah, she's known as the one who desegregated the State Fair of Texas, which was a big deal.
Absolutely.
You mentioned Lyndon Johnson a moment ago. I mean, here's a lifelong Southern politician. Were you concerned? I mean, did you know much about Johnson prior to him kind of seizing Kennedy's legacy?
I was, until he made his first speech to Congress. That must have been a week after Kennedy's assassination. And he indicated that he thought the biggest memorial they could make for Kennedy was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1963. And I felt that, hey, he's committed. And I later found out, but because he knew most of the Southern leaders, he'd say, I understand, you're going to have to fight against it. We're going to let you filibuster again, but we're going to pass it. And I don't think it would have passed as quickly under Kennedy, because he was president, but he didn't have the clout with the big people in Congress who Johnson knew. So I think after that speech in either late November or early December, I became convinced. I think he's sincere.
Johnson has such a complicated legacy between his support of civil rights and the escalation of the Vietnam War. How do you feel about Johnson and his legacy today?
His legacy obviously was tarnished by his involvement in Vietnam. And the sad thing about it, I think he knew much early on that he could not succeed. Kennedy was going to get out. But civil rights, I think he had a sterling record. He passed a very strong Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which passed after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Mm-hmm. Had it not been for his involvement in Vietnam, I think he would have gone down as one of the greatest presidents of all time.
Characterize for me the difference between the NAACP Youth Council and other organizations at that time, like SNCC and CORE and SCLC.
The NAACP Youth Council was an extension of the adult branch, and of course the adult branch had relied for a long time on the strategy that had been proposed by Charles Houston and really implemented by Thurgood Marshall, using the courts. And because people have this crazy notion that was easy. That was not easy. That was dangerous. To file lawsuits, to get people to file lawsuits. Many of the plaintiffs suffered for their involvement, but again, what had happened, it was the NAACP's success that made possible the activist phase. That's one of the things I taught my students. We had the activist phase of the civil rights movement that began to take place in the 1960s. And of course, I was part of that generation that was impatient. And we were pushing the adults, but then I later appreciated, boy, what brave people these must have been to file lawsuits against the powers that be at that particular time. A.P. Turo, who at one time was the only Black lawyer in the whole state of Louisiana. How brave he must have been. He got his son integrated into LSU, first Black undergraduate in the University of LSU, and he suffered greatly there. And I'm saying, the one thing I used to think that he was too cautious, he was patient. And he realized it's a long run game. But so most of the people involved in SNCC and SCLC and CORE were young people. And I think about that now. The NAACP Youth Council here in New Orleans was different because unlike most of the people in the other groups who were involved full time, they were not students. Julian Bond, who was one of my heroes, should have graduated in 1962. He got his bachelor's in 1975. Most of those dropped out of school. I was in school the whole time. So not only did I have, I'm involved in boycotts of Pinkerton, sit-ins and so forth. I went to jail several times. I was a student. It affected my grades.
You changed your major, didn't you?
I changed my major, right? I was a pre-med major, but I got involved in moving. Steve Ambrose was one of my professors. I don't know if you know Steve Ambrose. Mm-hmm. But I just got caught up in what's called the Civil Rights Revolution, because it wasn't just what's happening in New Orleans or even in Louisiana, the United States. Think about what was happening in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. And I often tell people I was a pre-med major and I was very good in the lab. I was good in cutting. I was squeamish around sick people, still am. So I may have changed anyway later on, but I was a pre-med major for 2.5 years, but I'd taken a history course, getting an A in it because I liked history. Then I switched, which delayed my graduating. I didn't finish for 5.5 years. I think I graduated about 175 hours because I had all of these science courses, but it provided me a more round background. I had, I think, 6 semesters of French. I had 3 semesters of German. I took more math than most history majors would have had, trigonometry, and I think I had maybe 6 or 7 semesters of English. So it took me a while, but I had a much more varied background than the average history major would have had. But it was important. It was dangerous because I remember not only were we active here in New Orleans, we would go out organizing youth councils and other places. I remember going to Opelousas to organize a youth council there, and the city had given us permission to meet in the Black Recreation Center, but they would not turn on the lights. And I'm talking to people, they couldn't see me. I know they couldn't see me. And I didn't think about how dangerous it was until later on. So I remember going to the NAACP convention in 1963. This was before Kennedy was assassinated. That was about 2 or 3 weeks after Medgar Evers had been assassinated. And we stopped in Brookhaven, Mississippi. I had never even heard of Brookhaven. I'm from New Orleans. I had never been further than Baton Rouge. And when we got to Brookhaven, we went into the Greyhound station, and there was an old guy. We laughed about it and said he must have been an ex-Confederate soldier. He was so old, but he resented us being there. And when we got to Jackson, Mississippi, we called Medgar Evers' brother Charles had taken over. And this is June of 1963. And we were outraged about the service we were receiving. And he said, "Are you guys crazy? This is Mississippi." But when you're in your late teens or early 20s, you don't think about that. And I think that was one of the differences. The core people were younger than the people in the adult branches of the NAACP, the people in the Youth Council. We felt that the adults were not moving fast enough. But their experiences were that this is dangerous. I didn't think about it at that particular time. I remember when we went to our first NAACP convention in Atlanta in 1962, we stopped in Evergreen, Alabama. And when the bus stopped, there was somebody, he may not even have been an official. He was outside and he was letting whites in and blacks were not. There were 5 of us young people in late teens. I think I might have been either 19 or 20. My wife, she must have been 17. And of the 5, he stopped 2 of us. The other 3 went through the back. They got in. Later on, there was somebody who came to New Orleans. He had seen that. He didn't know us, but he said, he was so afraid. He fully expected somebody to chase down the bus and to lynch us. Well, we laughed about that. When you're young, these stupid people doing all these foolish things to keep us out. We didn't realize the danger. When you're young, you're not as smart as you think you are.
What kind of training did the Youth Council have, if any, to prepare you for?
None.
None. Okay.
None. You're impulsive. And in many cases, not willing to accept advice from people who are older and who are smarter. Or, just to say, if you're single and you're young, when you eat, your family eats. You don't think about consequences. In fact, I tell people now, I would think long and hard now about some of the things that we did then. The bravest people were women. Oh, brave, without fear. Not always smart, because they would do things that I would not do. I was fearful because I was a president. So I was always concerned about the other people who I had some responsibility for. But it was fun most of the time. We did a lot of things together. In fact, I think I counted 9 or 10 couples got married out of the Youth Council. I married my wife. I was president. She was secretary. We've been married for 51 years.
Congratulations. Wow.
Thank you.
Did you notice, particularly during the summers in the mid-60s, an influx of white college students from the North coming down to volunteer?
Mm-hmm.
How
There were some who thought they knew everything with crazy suggestions. There were some who were naive, certainly well-intentioned, yeah, and we depended upon those. That's really what made the movement go, because again, as a result of white involvement, middle-class whites who were not really concerned before, but their kids were involved, and those were the ones who began to put pressure on the Congress and other people to do something. Mm-hmm. And, you know, kind of thinking, well, if we pass the Civil Rights Act, all of this is going to be over and everything will go back to the way it was. They were in a minority, but they were helpful, but they caught hell. I mean, the people who opposed us, they really felt that it was the young whites, you know, even older whites who were there who betrayed them. Because these were brave people who played a role.
How did your family feel about your involvement?
They were afraid, and it's interesting because there was a dichotomy between my mother and my father. My father worked in one of those parishes I mentioned where a lot of these whites were moving. That's where he worked. It was smaller, but rigidly white controlled. And because he worked there, he obviously was fearful of my safety, but also fearful of his job. He worked at the same company, Domino Sugar Refinery, for 46 years. And while my mother and some of my siblings joined the NAACP, my father did not join because he feared that it could affect his job. Well, it's interesting, in April of 1965, in anticipation of the equal employment section of the law going into effect in July of 1965, Judge Muriel, who was the president of the branch at that time, held a conference, and he invited companies that would be affected to remind him and an attempt to assist them to begin to comply with the law. Well, actually, where my father worked was fully integrated because it was unionized. And the restaurant facilities had been desegregated in the 1950s. But anyway, the personnel director came, and I'm a junior, and I was on the program. And after I had spoken, he came to say, "You're Ralph's boy. You're Ralph's boy." So, yes. "Well, you're a fine lad." So he went back to the refinery, called my father, and my father had no idea why he was being called in. He said, "I met your son. You must be really proud of him. He is a fine young man." My daddy paid his dues that day. Now, he had been supportive. They attended rallies. But again, he's concerned that if they found out something had happened, my mother was very supportive. In fact, she was very jealous of our accomplishment, and she mentioned about preachers trying to take credit for what he had done. So the family was supportive. My siblings, most of them were involved, were at least in paying memberships, but none of them were actively on the picking line like I was.
You mentioned you were arrested a few times earlier. Are there any stories or memories about that you can share?
I remember the first time I was arrested for trying to desegregate the cafeteria at City Hall. And think about that. We could not go into our own cafeteria paid for with funds by Black taxpayers. And I was arrested, and I went to jail by myself. And I was apprehensive. You know, I'd see that. I remember watching the Western movies, the Lone Ranger's in jail, and he could call out to his horse. When you are locked up, there are a lot of doors that are locked behind you, not just one. I think at least 6 doors were locked behind. So there was no way of anybody breaking out. But I remember being a little bit fearful. You could hear rumors about what happened to you inside of jail. And I was in jail when I first went. I was with somebody who was charged with murder. But then the Blacks who were there found out why I was there, and they indicated how proud they were of us, you young bloods, and keep up the good work. So I was only there, I think I was there 6 hours. 6 hours is a long time when you're locked up. You hear people talking about only serving 6 years. 6 hours, a long time. So we got out. The next time I remember we were arrested for picketing a Black Mardi Gras ball. We were saying that Blacks should not be participating in Mardi Gras while we were trying to fight for equal rights. And we were arrested for picketing a Black ball by 2 Black policemen, ironically. And 2 white policemen picked us up and went to what we were doing. And said, "Well, you can't be arrested for picketing." Well, we are. Well, the Black policeman had told them to hold us until the ball was over. So we had some interesting situations.
Do you think those African-American officers were fearful there might be some violence or something?
No, they were supportive of the people who were wanting to dance. And later on, they indicated they regretted. Both of them, there were two of them, indicated how much they regretted being involved. But that happened.
Let's move ahead. Tell me a little bit about your academic career, because you were the first African-American professor at University of New Orleans, right?
First Black instructor at UNO in 1969. Well, the first time I taught it was as a teaching assistant, a graduate teaching assistant in 1967. And I remember when I walked in and indicated I'd be teaching, there was a class of 35 people, only one Black. Two of the whites walked out. And they went to the department chair and demanded a transfer. And he asked why, and they said, for obvious reasons. And his response, well, for obvious reasons, we're not going to transfer you. Well, they stayed in and they took an F. Now, I mentioned that bothered me a long time, the fact that these two guys walked out, until maybe 15 years later, I realized, well, but 34 stayed. Two left, but 34 of them stayed. For whatever reason, that had bothered me. It was a very, very good experience. I remember I had one young man at the end of the semester, he came by and we talked. And he mentioned that he believed in equal rights, but he thought that God had intended for the races to be separate. And I said, well, if you stay here, your views are going to change. And he said, I know. That's why I'm leaving, because I don't want my views to change. And I think about that now, how sad. Because by that particular time, LSU and New Orleans had become much more liberal, certainly more liberal than any of the other universities. And he didn't want his views to change. But I remember walking to class one day, and there were two maintenance people outside, and I didn't realize that this was a classroom and it had a balcony and you could see into it. So I told you he's teaching that class. And I realized how important that was, not just for me, but for other people. That until that particular time, Black people cooked and served in the cafeteria, but you didn't have any even Black cashiers. There were no Black secretaries. And for them, that was a step in the right direction.
How much of your own activism did you convey to your students?
Very little, unless it was a class that involved that. So in other words, if I was teaching the first half of American history, which only went through the Civil War, I didn't talk about it. And there were a lot of people who were surprised later on. I always tried to stay on point, not let people get me involved in other things. I was certainly very proud of it. I remember the very first time I talked about my involvement was at Lehigh University. I was a graduate student at Lehigh University, and in the only Black history class I ever had, it was from one of the professors who had taught me at UNO, and he came to Lehigh. And he had me to talk about my involvement, and because Lehigh was very, very white. It was a very, very interesting experience. I enjoyed it because I found out there's a difference between whites. The Jews complained about being discriminated against, and the prejudice was more against poor people. They used to talk about the scholarship kids. But they were very, very impressed with it. But in courses where the class talked about the civil rights period, then I would talk about my involvement. But other than that, I didn't.
Over the years, I mean, you've seen a wide range of students. Do you feel that the interest in the 60s, engagement with the 60s, has it waned or kind of gone back and forth?
I think it's waned because it may not be stressed as much, but this is something that people are very interested in. And maybe some people have gotten tired talking about it, but I find that most people are interested in it because it's hard even to explain to my own children. I have two children, a son and a daughter, what it was like to be denied the right to even drink from a water fountain or to go to a restaurant. It's painful, I think, for older Blacks like myself sometimes to talk about it. So maybe we don't do as good a job in talking about it. But no, I find that a lot of people are very much interested in it. I mean, there's some who are in denial, but I had a very good relationship with students. Um, by chance, I'm going to be the commencement speaker at UNO after all of these years. And
Wow.
it was posted, and then I think maybe 15 people responded to it. One of the person was in that first class. He later became a dean. And he mentioned being in that class. And even back then, he found that there was something special about my relationship with students. So, you know, you don't get rich teaching in terms of money, but I like teaching. I love teaching. So it was really an opportunity for me to extend my civil rights career in that sense.
How do you feel about young activism today?
It's different. In fact, it's something even the last 10 to 15 years that I taught, I would talk to students, but why were they not more involved? I mentioned, for example, I remember when I started UNO, tuition was $25 a semester. And I remember when they started raising tuition, I said, you guys don't even protest. Students protest when they raise the tuition from $25 to $40. You guys don't protest with any, but it's a little bit different. And I think what it is, because when I started college and when I was an undergrad in the early 60s, it almost was a given. When you got a college degree, you had a job waiting for you. That's no longer true. So a lot of these students, because tuition has risen, are working. I did work part-time, but not as much as these students. I didn't have any student loans to be concerned about. So I think because they're more concerned about, is there going to be a job waiting for me when I finish? So they are not as involved as I thought they could have been. And I told them, you know, the world over is really student movements. Look at what's happening in Asia. Look what's happening in Europe. Most of the revolutions were led by students. Now, students don't win it. I mean, I often tell people, the guy who threw a brick can start a revolution, but you got to have somebody with brains who's going to win it. King was not just somebody on the street. He's a PhD. So get involved. And they do, but a lot of that activism, as you mentioned, Wayne's. I remember when I was at Lehigh, the students had to protest, and they won the right to be on the board of trustees, and you had student members of the departments. Well, after 4 or 5 meetings, that's not important. It comes and goes. So I think, you know, like the Black Lives Matters and the other movements, you find a lot of students, a lot of white students involved, but over a period of time, it kind of peters out. So it comes and goes. Well, that's not necessarily bad, because again, your first primary is a student. And I remember when I met the first time, John Hope Franklin, who I had a lot of respect for, and he mentioned your first priority is your profession. And he was very actively involved. He was one of the scholars who did the research that led to the overturning Plessy. But your first priority is to the profession. You can do both.
As a historian and also as a 1960s activist, I'm really curious for your thoughts on the controversy involving Confederate memorials and what should be done with those and the pain they cause people today.
I'm not opposed to moving them, but they would not be a top priority for me, because most people don't even know who these people are. I don't think about it. I mean, I know them because I'm a historian, but the average person would not know who they are. But, you know, I'm in favor of removing them because, again, it's an example of the Confederates losing the war, but then winning the peace. The people who were engaged in treason were the ones who subsequently won. So you have their names all over everything. So, yeah, I'm in favor of it, but it would not be something I would put at the top of my agenda.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you today? Any other particular stories or memories related to either?
Oh, I'm sure you have, but I'm not sure I can remember that. I was trying to think of. Oh, I remember this was in, I think, 1984. 3 of us, the advisor to the NAACP Youth Council, Orleans NAACP, and another member, we had gone to the NAACP state. No, it must have been a regional convention, 5 states in the Southwest region in Shreveport. And on our way back a Sunday morning, we stopped at a Shoney's restaurant in Monroe. And while we were there, it must have been late morning because there were people were coming from church for breakfast, and everybody in the place was white except for the three of us and the support staff. And no, nobody bothered us, but I remember asking Sonia, we are here and it's almost as if we're invisible. Why are white people fighting so hard to keep us out of here? And Sonia often has an answer to everything. And he said, I don't know. And then I thought about it. Well, why are we fighting so hard to get in here? It certainly had to be more than about the right to sit at a lunch counter. So, you know, it makes you think going back, but I had so many good experiences. I remember coming back again from that NAACP convention in DC in 1964, and it was right after Schwerner, Goodwin, and what's the other guy's name? I should know. Cheney had been missing. And we were sitting on Greyhound bus in, I think, South Carolina. We had on our NAACP sweatshirts, and we were sitting at the very front of the bus, and they changed drivers. And I remember the driver saying, see, these NAACP folks sitting up here was like spitting in his face. And I thought, well, you know, we must be winning. So, I mean, there were a lot of incidents like that, you know, you'd be discouraged. But I remember one incident where I was picketing by myself, again, because I was the president, I was there every day, by myself. And the Shriners were in town. And I think this guy was from Alabama, and he saw me and he determined to walk through me. And I remember we used to carry signs with a handle on it. So it gives us a little bit more protection than the sandwich board signs. And I could see that he's trying to come through me, and I just put my sign down, and he must have weighed about 200 pounds. At that time, I might have weighed 160. And he turned around, he didn't say anything, but I think I made a point. Another time, there was this guy who, again, picketing by myself, and I walked through him, and he punched me. And, you know, we used to have the sign that, you know, white boys can't fight. I could still feel that punch today, but I broke my sign over his head. And I used the remainder of the sign to fence him off because he was bigger than I was. And then I went to get a policeman. And this policeman said something which was so insightful because we had had an incident with him maybe a month or so earlier where he had pushed our advisor out of the door, and we had filed a complaint against him. And he came, because by the time he came, the guy was gone. He said, y'all almost cost me my job. Headquarters told me not to touch it. And I'm thinking, wow, we have that kind of power. Headquarters told you not to touch it. But because by that time, my vice president came, he was about 20 pounds less than I was. And he was saying, I wish I had been here. I said, I wish I had been here too. But there were people on the side, blacks on the side, who were saying what I should have done. None of them came to my rescue, but it could be dangerous. But you know, a lot of times while I was down there picketing, I was deep in thought. I didn't pay much attention. I remember I was picketing by myself and walking back and forth, and a black woman came up to me and said, you're picketing here, huh? Yeah. Well, I'm going to help you. Okay, going to help him. Then she walks in the store, and I'm saying bad things about her under my breath. She's going to help us, and she's going inside the store where we were picketing. About an hour later, she came out with 2 handbags, and there are tags on all the items. She was a shoplifter. She said she was helping us. Well, she called herself, I'm a booster. I said, get away from here, because I don't want them to think that we're involved in this. She called herself helping by stealing. Well, that's really not what we were looking for. But you know, you met all kinds of interesting characters out there. I remember one day it was so cold. Again, I'm the only one out there, and I'm picketing by myself. And these 3 kids came. One was 11, one was 9, the other was 8. And I mentioned that in one of the speeches I gave. These little kids came down on the day. It was so cold. And the one thing I remember, they had on mittens. They didn't have on gloves. These were kids who had on mittens. And I say, this is something I will always remember, mittens. Well, 2 of those kids are dead. One of them is still living, and I never forgot that. young kids who obviously weren't looking for jobs. And a lot of people thought we got paid. You didn't get paid. The rule was if you picketed for 4 hours, we would buy you lunch. Lunch was a hot dog and a soft drink that cost about 25 cents. And we would pay your bus fare. So 10 cents each way. The bus was 10 cents coming, 10 cents going. We didn't get paid. But it was a sense that, hey, this is important. And I mentioned the young people. College students were a little bit different. They were a good number, but then they were the college students, the ones we called the philosophers, who couldn't get involved because they thought that they were not nonviolent. Well, our definition was nonviolent was we'd give you the first hit, but we were going to respond. You hit me, I'm going to hit you back. And that's why I had so much respect for Dr. King. The times he went to jail, the physical beating that he took, you have to be brave to do that. I mean, people don't understand that. That's bravery. Somebody's beating you and you respond with violence, with nonviolence. So I have the ultimate respect for him.
What years were you president of the Youth Council?
From 1960 to 1966. I was president for 6 years.
Wow.
When I stepped down, I was just starting my graduate classes at UNO. I started the master's program in the spring of 67, and I got my master's in the spring of 68. And then I went to Lehigh, which was really very great because I was so disillusioned by the assassination of King and Bobby Kennedy. It really affected me very, very hard. So that was really a change of pace to go to Lehigh. And the first year I went to Lehigh, they had gone out of their way to recruit more Blacks. There were 35 Black undergraduates they brought in. So I think there were 40 of us. I was the only Black doctorate candidate. And I think there was one woman who was a master's candidate. It was so different. And I lived on the right side of town for the first time. You know, I lived where the WASP lived. Lehigh was on the south side of town where a lot of the immigrants were, and they were heavily Democratic. Because I remember I got hired to do the opinion polls for the race between Nixon and Humphrey, and I remember I forgot the guy. He was a Republican senator from, if I call his name, you remember him, from Pennsylvania, who later switched and became a Democrat. But you did a poll, and I remember George Wallace was in the race. And so we asking people who they'd vote for. And I remember this woman who was sending a message to me, I'm going to vote for Wallace so he could stop these goddamn riots. And then I remember an older white man said he was going to vote for Wallace too. But then on my way back, he was waiting for me to apologize. I can't vote for Wallace. That made it something with rolling over people with tanks. He said, I'll probably vote for Humphrey. But the immigrants, who are you going to vote for? The Democrat. Who are you going to vote for president? The Democrat. Who are you going to vote for council? The Democrat. Who are you going to vote for DA? The Democrat. And that was very interesting. But Lehigh was upper middle class. And I got a chance to see how the rich live. I say every poor boy to see how rich people live. And I was a teaching assistant. And I remember I was invited to one of the frat houses for pub night. the steaks that they fed their dogs. You know, and I say, wow, this is interesting. And I remember one of the Jewish guys, very, very nice guy, he was always complaining about his wealth. I said, well, do something with your wealth. He complained about a Jewish quarter at Lehigh. Only 13% of the students were Jewish. I don't know if that was true or not. But I said, well, you know, you want to do something, give me a ride. And I remember I happened to see his father's jewelry store in New York. And I'd come from New Orleans where you have these little small jewelry companies and you might see something $500, $1,000. And I'm looking in the window and I'm saying, well, where is the decimal point? I'd never seen anything for $50,000 or $75,000. Wait, that can't be $75,000. But anyway, I remember him arranging a ride. I was coming back to New Orleans. And so I used to fly through Newark so I could get a direct flight. And he arranged for me to get a ride with two of his friends, two young whites. I never knew them and never saw them before since. But I remember they stopped at one of the guys' houses in New Jersey. And you see pictures on these soap operas where the housewives are doing something around the house in business suits. So I saw one of those. So people really live like that. So I'm sitting in the car, they're basically talking to themselves. They were going to go to Ireland for Easter. I was going to go home. And don't worry about bringing any golf clubs, because if it rains, we have golf clubs in the next island. I said, people actually live like that. So that was an eye opener for me, and I loved it.
Wow. Well, if there's no, do you have any other stories or memories? I feel like
I'm sure I have many, but I can't think of some of them now. But it's something I'd like to say, that it was serious, it was dangerous, but we had fun, because most of the people in our youth council would we would socialize together. We'd have sock hops, we'd have dinners, we'd have dances. We go to convention together, and we were siblings basically. And when we get together, we think, we did some good things. I mean, there are people who try to downplay it, but we did some good things. We met important people. Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., person who, again, I think we had more impact on me, my generation, was Julian Bond. I got to know Julian fairly well when he became chairman of the board of the NAACP. And I remember the last time I saw him, I didn't realize that he was ill, but I saw him a couple of months before his death. And I waved at him, and I mentioned to my wife, Julian has really aged. And I wish I had gotten up and embraced him, because he died, I guess, maybe about 6 weeks later. And I didn't know he was ill. He didn't let on. With somebody who I had great respect for. I only met John Lewis once. I had a lot of respect for him. In fact, I remember reading the speech that he was not allowed to give at the March on Washington. He had to tone down his speech, and I was so impressed with that. So we had heroes who were in our age group. We had people who were older. I knew Roy Wilkins, got a chance to go to his funeral, and other people. So it was beneficial. I saw in person, I think, 5 presidents. Ironically, the president who I got closer to seeing was Ronald Reagan. When he invited himself to an NAACP convention in 1981, I was one of the convention chairs at that particular time, but I was on the wrong side of the podium. So he shook hands with everybody as he was coming in. He didn't shake hands with the rest of us, but it's something I wouldn't trade for anything. Very rewarding.